She's back, just when we had tramped the dirt down, when we thought we had driven a stake through her cold heart. Margaret Thatcher is back. She's back because the 30-year rule has allowed to emerge what the former Tory Chancellor Nigel Lawson described as the nearest thing to a cabinet riot in the modern history of cabinet government. It turns out that at one and the same time as Mrs. Thatcher was telling us that the NHS was safe in her hands, that where there was discord, she would sow harmony, she was planning the complete privatisation of our National Health Service, charging you for everything, forcing you to take out private health insurance, and, moreover, to charge you for going to school and to university long before Tony Blair introduced the tuition fees. The papers which have emerged are utterly damning, and you can well imagine why they locked them up for 30 years, but they didn't count on cabinet colleagues like Nigel Lawson being there to tell us what it was like at the time when the full Milton Friedman package, when the Chicago boys came to London and persuaded Margaret Thatcher to utterly transform our social services, our welfare system, our education system, and our National Health Service. In fact, even after the near cabinet riot against her, she continued, and the papers make it clear, to soften up minister after minister for her savage, draconian proposals. This is of interest, historically speaking, of course, for those of us who were fighting her at the time, even more so. But it's important today also. When you next hear a Tory Prime Minister or a Health Minister telling you that the NHS is safe in their hands, that they have accepted the post-war settlement for a healthcare system free at the point of need, national and in public hands, you know now that you can't believe a word that they say. You may already have suspected that, perhaps frequently alleged that, but now you don't have to look into the crystal ball. You can read the books. Under the 30-year rule, the papers are now in the public domain. And full marks to those newspapers today. The Mirror I saw, there may have been others who went to town on this. If you are a certain age, you remember the ghost town that Britain became under Margaret Thatcher. You remember how she closed the coal industry, the steel industry, the shipbuilding industry, the car industry, the truck industry, the railway workshops industry. You remember how she paved with concrete the industrial areas of Britain. You remember how she made rust belt after rust belt of whole swathes of our country, all in the pursuit of a free market dogma laid bare in the cabinet papers released in the last day or so. If you are of a certain age, you remember how fatuous the idea that if only we could have a woman Prime Minister, that the place would be kinder and gentler, that there would be fewer wars, that a heart might be present in governmental affairs. In truth, Margaret Thatcher murdered much of this country. Sure, there was loads of money in the city, in the Big Bang. Sure, there was loads of money for the spivs and the hucksters. but for honest, hard-working, working people and their families and their communities, there was only dereliction. There was only the ghost town. And by the way, we've never recovered from that. And that's one of the reasons why we voted for Brexit in June when we got the chance. Not because necessarily, without anything else changing, Brexit will re-industrialise these rust belts, but because people knew that the political class, Thatcher, Major, Blair, Brown, Cameron and May, are all different cheeks of the same backside, and they wanted to give that backside a good whack. Now we'll be talking about both John Major and Tony Blair later in the programme. I should say, in the interests of balance, that we will have Tim Bell, now Lord Bell, advisor to Margaret Thatcher for 3 successful election campaigns. Well, successful for her and for them, but not for the rest of us. And we'll be talking to Matthew Doyle, former special advisor to Tony Blair. So we're giving the other side a point of view to express, but we want your point of view more than that. Why John Major? Why disinter such a ghostly figure as John Major? Sir John Major, as he's now known. Well, Sir John Major thinks that 17 million people in Britain who voted for Brexit need to be led by the nose back to the polling booths to vote for a second time. It's funny how all these politicians that slagged off the SNP for wanting a second referendum so soon after the first are so keen on a neverendum on the issue of Brexit. And Tony Blair is back too. Just when you thought it was safe to get back into the water, he's back. Divested himself, he says, of many of the money-making scams that have netted him £100 million in 8 years, £25 million worth of houses alone, just when he divested himself of those business interests. I knew that he was coming back. And he's told us there will be an announcement in the new year about the second coming of Tony Blair. He thinks JC is a nutter. He thinks Theresa May is a lightweight. And he thinks he's neither a nutter or a lightweight. More than that, he thinks he's indispensable, and that if Britain is going to be saved, it's up to him to save it. So he's going to make a block in Parliament of Blairite Labour MPs, Europhile Tory MPs, the Liberal Democrats, and yes, the SNP. What a dilemma that's going to be. Are they more pro-Europe than they are anti-Blair? We'll soon find out, because Mr. Blair is the new leader of the Remain campaign. And just in the last 24 hours, we discovered that in a very, very expensive restaurant where some bottles of wine cost £4,000, the Riverside Cafe, I think it's called, in a swish part of London, Alastair Campbell and Peter Mandelson were addressing not so much the great and the good, but the formerly powerful and the vile. They were addressing them on the need to up the fight to block Brexit. So I know there are many decent people out there who are against leaving the European Union, but you're about to be led into battle by the most indecent political figure in Britain since the Second World War. That's right, I consider Tony Blair to be even more indecent than Margaret Thatcher. John Major I always thought was a decent fellow. I thought he was a Democrat. But no, you're going to be asked to keep on voting until you vote the right way. So, we'll be talking about all of that, plus a certain Donald Trump. Will Nigel Farage be the British ambassador in Washington, or the American ambassador in London, or in Brussels? Is Nigel Farage headed for the United States and a place at the feet in the vulgar golden tower of Trumpism? Is the United States going to recount the ballot in crucial swing states, as Dr. Jill Stein, the Green Party candidate, is presently trying to organise? As a matter of fact, she's now raised millions of dollars in just 48 hours to mount that recount challenge. Will it work? Will Trump be stopped in his tracks? Who better to talk us through all of these issues than the sage John Le Boutillier, coming from Washington? It's going to be the mother of all talk shows tonight. Now, my first guest of the evening is an old pal of mine for 30 years, more than 30 years. He's Ronnie Campbell. He's the Labour MP for Blythe Valley and a member of Labour Leave, a man covered in honour in the great Brexit debate. And I want to ask him what he thinks about the return of Tony Blair. Ronnie, welcome to the show, my dear friend.
Hiya.
Now, did your blood run cold at the thought of Tony Blair coming back to block Brexit?
No, I don't think so. I think he's what I call the yesterday's man. If you remember that a few years ago, when we tried to portray the Tories as yesterday men, I think that's what Tony Blair, Gordon Brown and Mandelson are, basically yesterday's men.
Yes, but they have the support of almost all the ruling class, the finance capital, citadels.
Oh, they will.
They have the support of the majority of the newspapers, of the BBC. So they're not exactly going to be pushing against the grain of the establishment, Ronnie.
You certainly mentioned them all there, didn't you? The finances, the papers, the newspapers, which are not Labour. Even the Daily Mail, the Daily Mirror goes a long way trying to push the Tories. I mean, it's really bad when you've got the Tory press praising Blair coming back. That really is bad. That should be a lesson.
Well, he had a very fancy dinner. Campbell and Mandelson represented him last night in a very fancy restaurant. £4,000 for a bottle of wine. Not many takers for that up in Morpeth, Northumberland.
No, not in my place.
and at that dinner, they were planning the fight back. How dangerous is the likelihood of the House of Lords introducing, delaying, blocking mechanisms that will make conditional on pressing the button for Article 50 the holding of a second referendum at the end of it?
I think that's the idea. That's what they come together for. There's no doubt about that. They're not Democrats. I'm a Democrat, and there was a decision by the British people. We know what it is. They don't need to say it. They made that decision, and that's got to be carried out. At least there's one thing about the Tories. At least they seem to be wanting to carry it out, where Labour just seems to be wanting, especially the Blairites, wanting to put spokes in the wheel as quick as possible.
Well, Blair, I estimate that of the 171 or 72 people who mounted the coup against Jeremy Corbyn, your friend and mine, that 100 of them, and I think I'm being kind, 100 of them have their ultimate loyalty to Tony Blair. There's probably about 60 to 80 Tory MPs that are absolutely rejecting the Brexit decision, and of course you've got the Liberal Democrats, and ironically you've got more than 50 SNP MPs. So Blair will be leading a very considerable parliamentary bloc.
Yeah, well, but still, you've got to remember these MPs have got to go back to their constituents. Tony Blair hasn't, and neither some of the Lords. They're not elected. So I don't know what they've got to say about Brexit, the people voting that way. And MPs, well, if your constituency voted overwhelmingly to leave, then you've got to go back and explain to them why you want to stay and why you're voting to undo what they voted for.
Quite so. And of course, and here's a point you might make for me, Ronnie, as I'm not there to make it myself. If we're going to have a referendum at the end of the negotiation, that guarantees the hardest possible line from the EU in the negotiations to make the outcome so unpalatable that they might get the result they want in the referendum.
I think that's why everybody's keeping their cards close to their chest, and everybody on the Remain side want them to show the hand, because if they show the hand now, then the Europeans, obviously the French, the Germans, and whatever, and Gunter and the whole lot of them, they'll give us a hard time. Make no mistake about that, and hope that Blair and Mandelson and Brown can actually overturn the democratic wishes of this country. And on their heads be it, but of course, they're not elected by anybody now. They're out on their own, as I said, they're yesterday's men.
Mind you, it's all going so badly. Jaguar Land Rover have just announced 10,000 new jobs manufacturing vehicles in England. Not too bad for a Brexit Britain. And
we've secured a Nissan up in Sunderland as well, so it's not too bad at the minute. And you know something, I think the people of Britain wants to be out of Europe because of them reasons and them reasons only. And you have to also remember, George, when they talk about we're going to give you a hard time, then okay, give us a hard time. But you export more to us than we to you. So we can give you a hard time as well. Now, I'm sure Merkel doesn't want to sack 10,000 car workers in Mercedes.
Exactly so. We've took hard times from them before, Ronnie. We'll be fine. Ronnie Campbell, Member of Parliament for Blythe Valley, a real Labour MP. Thanks for joining me on the mother of all talk shows this evening. Now let me read some of the shoals of communications flowing in on Twitter, especially at George Galloway or at talkRADIO or both, or of course by email. And here's one on email. The middle class and upper class establishment elite, Tony Blair, John Major, etc., are fighting back hard to wreck the working class Brexit victory. I say it's up to people like you, George Galloway, to take on these tyrants and teach them a lesson. Thank you for that, my friend. Kevin Hughes says Thatcher thrives on in the ideology of Tony Blair's disciples. Well, of course, that's true. When asked what her greatest legacy was, Mrs. Thatcher answered in 4 words: Tony Blair, New Labour. And Balder the Brave says, I stand behind the comments of UK athletics saviour John Major. Hundreds voted out on the back of a pack of lies. Well, we won by well over 1 million, so if hundreds were misled, Balder, I doubt if that is electorally significant. Trotsky says, post-revelations of Thatcher's privatisation plans of the NHS, are the public entitled to a refund of the costs of her museum and state funeral, against which I spoke, I hope, strongly at the time. Euroman, an activist, says Thatcher was able to create a police state and dictatorship. Britain, that was her ugly legacy. And C. Jester says, what America needs to do is to return to British rule. Well, one day we've got rid of May. Well, look, we don't actually want you. There's too much trouble in America. And Trotsky again says Sheffield University study shows Thatcher's destruction of old industries costs the United Kingdom £30 billion per year. She's responsible for the deficit. And Catalysis Cat says, hasn't the EU promised to kick us out if the process takes too long? Don't think Blair can do a damn thing. Well, I've been kicked out of worse places than the EU. Stephen the Verb says, I hope Blair carries on. It will make more people support Brexit. And Mikey says, Blair is a war criminal and should be in The Hague. Does he honestly think we have forgotten? The great two-tone maestros, the specials, Ghost Town. That's what Thatcher made of Britain, and now we know, thanks to the release of papers freed up under the 30-year rule, that it could actually have been worse. She was intending to charge you for going to school and to force you to take out private medical insurance, thus abolishing the health service. Can you imagine? And only the nearest thing to a cabinet riot, says former Chancellor Nigel Lawson, stopped her. But actually it didn't stop her, because the papers make clear she worked for years with that block of wood, Geoffrey Howe, mano a mano, to try and persuade cabinet colleagues to drop their opposition. Here's the first call from Manchester. It's Paul. Paul, welcome to the show.
Good evening, sir. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. What would you like to say?
Yeah, I was doing some research on yourself, actually. You're about 10 days older than me. You was born in August.
That's right.
The beginning of August, or the middle of August.
Middle of August, 16th.
Yes, sir. I was born on the 29th. However, what I'm getting at is that we've both been through all them decades of different political parties. Now, I know I don't know whether you're still involved in politics.
I certainly am.
You are, sir. And I don't know whether your ambitions is to become an MP again. I don't know. But, with all due respect to you, sir, you're a very, very honest man. But I've found throughout my life that most politicians tell lies.
Yep. Even Thatcher, even Thatcher's friends used to say, well, you might hate her, but at least she's honest. At least you know what she's going to do. But it turns out, Paul, that we didn't know.
Yeah.
We didn't know any of this. It took us 30 years to know it.
That's exactly right, sir. I remember the Thatcher years very, very well, as you will do. You'll know about it more than me. But I remember when she was the Education Secretary, and before she stabbed Ted Heath in the back.
Yep.
And what she did with the third of a pint of milk.
Yeah, she stole our milk. One of my first demonstrations, the slogan was Margaret Thatcher, Milk Snatcher. Little did she know she'd snatch everything else, never mind the milk.
Yeah, and then what she did to the coal miners.
Yep. And the steel workers.
Steel workers.
And the car industry. We could go on.
We could go on. At the time I was working for a company making building blocks in Manchester. I think I'm allowed to give a name. It was Thermalite Building Blocks.
Yep.
I don't know whether they still exist, but their head office was in Birmingham, I think. Now that was, I worked there for about 4 years, but I remember a friend of mine saying that Thatcher's got in and that we'll be out of a job. And I said, well, I don't know whether we will be. And it did happen because the building industry just slumped. And that was the end of Thermalite.
Yeah, the London Brick Company, the biggest brick company in the whole country, went out of business because there was hardly a brick being laid. All the bricks were being knocked down. Yes,
sir, yes. But you see, the other thing is, right the way through that, you see, we must be very naive because she was voted back in 3 times, one of it on the back of the Falklands War, the soldiers who went to fight in the South Atlantic, and some of them never came back, tragically.
Indeed, many of them left their guts on Goose Green in order to re-elect Margaret Thatcher.
And two of them won the Victoria Cross. But I mean, she was voted back in because of that. And I thought to myself...
I'll tell you, she was voted back in, Paul, because of that. And then she was up against the plonker, Neil Kinnock, that nobody outside of his own family regarded as prime ministerial material in any shape or form.
Yes. But, you know, we must be so naive because we keep voting for people who are diametrically opposed to the working classes, and I don't know why we keep doing these things, but there you go.
Indeed. Paul, it's been nice to talk to you. A man done certain age like myself. Let's talk to a much younger woman, Kathy in Liverpool. Go ahead, Kathy.
Hi, George.
Hi there.
So it feels great to be able to speak to you.
And you.
I'm phoning up just to make a few comments and observations about some of the things you've talked about already on the show. And I remember Thatcher taking the milk away as well. I'm not that young, but I was 4 when she did it. One of my earliest memories of growing up during those Thatcher eras was a feeling of darkness and oppression. And obviously you can hear in my accent, I'm not from Liverpool, I'm actually from Belfast. But on Tony Blair, I'd like to say that I think that he's an opportunist. I feel that he has shown outwardly that he has no moral compass whatsoever. He stood in front of the press, the world media, a couple of months ago after Chilcot came out. He professed to apologise and thought that's enough. It's a disgrace, like one of your other tweeters or listeners have said, that he isn't in The Hague facing charges of, war criminal. I feel that many decent Remainers will maybe be fooled into thinking that Tony Blair could emerge as their saviour. I feel that there may be financiers, bankers, all of those people who seek to reduce democracy and to increase the inequality that is happening around the world at the minute to profit for themselves. I believe the Brexit, the whole idea of Brexit, as tarnished as the campaign was during the whole run-up to the referendum, people were left with many, decisions, hard decisions that they had to do when voting for whether or not they wanted to remain or whether they wanted to leave the EU. Those people who were put up as the Brexiteers on the television, it was a disgrace.
Charlatans.
So you imagine the left.
Charlatans. You
imagine the left having to watch that, and there was no one from the left to represent why Brexit could be good for, Britain.
We never missed Tony Benn more than we did in that campaign, Kathy.
And, and unfortunately, his legacy, his own son, was the first to wager a coup against Jeremy Corbyn.
Yep.
I mean, the idea that democracy is being reduced constantly in this country, and people need to wake up and start voting properly. And, people have voted and it isn't being listened to.
Kathy, a wonderful call. By the way, I'm in Derry on Sunday night and Belfast on Monday night and South Armagh on Tuesday night and Dublin on Wednesday night with my film about Tony Blair and answering people's questions there. And we've been, of course, a couple of times, more than that, up in Liverpool. Wonderful to talk to you. Kathy in Liverpool, thank you very much indeed. Coming up later in the programme, we'll talk to Matthew Doyle, former special advisor to Tony Blair, about this very topic. Now, let me take some more tweets and other communications. Steve Neary says, hard to argue with Blair being worse than Thatcher. At least you knew Thatcher was going to screw you over. Nothing worse than a fraud. And John says, talk, someone needs to tell this grinning, fake, orange skin tanned, interfering messpot, Tony Blair, that he has had his time in power. Time to clear off, phony tone, says John. And Dave Parak says, no, Brexit is going to cause a recession. You can't keep blaming the other side. And an email from Giles in Surrey. I welcome back Tony Blair with open arms. Let's hope Tony can get rid of that Shylock Corbyn and his cronies and then get the Brexit vote reversed. Why don't you give me a call, Giles? I'd really like to talk to you, Giles. And Donald Duck says, on Jaguar Land Rover, you couldn't be more wrong. They said there may be 10,000 jobs in the future. Well, Donald Duck, I just read the Financial Times, the Bible of these matters, and Jaguar Land Rover are going to create 10,000 new manufacturing jobs in Britain. And here's a text, unusually. In a second referendum, every Leave voter should refuse to vote. Surely a very low turnout would render the referendum void, says Alan in Edinburgh. Oh, I've got my doubts about that tactic, Alan. The great Elvis Costello, troubadour to the Thatcher years. So many from which we could choose. Now, a lot of people are writing to me expressing their astonishment that I regarded John Major as a decent fellow. I must tell you that I served in Parliament under Margaret Thatcher, John Major, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown and David Cameron, and John Major was the only decent human being amongst them. I had many occasions to seek private engagement with him on constituency matters, large and small, and he was the only one who never refused and who always acted where he could on what you needed. John Major is a decent man. The rest were frankly punks. Yes, punks. And they wrecked this country. Now, I have many political disagreements with John Major, not the least being his joining up with Tony Blair, Nick Clegg, Peter Mandelson, Alistair Campbell, John Sawyer, the former head of Britain's intelligence services, plutocrats, autocrats, billionaires, all in a fancy restaurant last night to plot as to how they could destroy the decision of the British people to leave the European Union. So, Sir John, you and me are finished. Here's Dougie on the phone from somewhere. Let's hear what he has to say. Go ahead, Doug.
Hello, George.
Right,
nice
mate.
to speak to you.
And you.
Regarding the Brexit result, the point I'd like to make is, if Scotland voted to leave, would Nicola Sturgeon want a second referendum on the terms of leaving Great Britain?
Well, she probably will never give up looking for an opportunity to have a referendum, and that's obvious because she's the leader of a party that wants to break up this small island called Britain, a small island in a small world, a small island of English-speaking people who largely work for the same employers, if they're in unions, are in the same unions, read the same papers, magazines, watch the same television, watch the same movies, listen to the same music. All seems a bit silly to me.
Now, but the point I'm making, George, is, would she want a second referendum if Scotland voted to leave the UK?
Dougie, should want a second referendum if there was a Y in the day of the week. She just wants a second referendum because she wants to break up the country.
Now, George, I'm sorry, you might be misrepresenting what I'm saying. If Scotland voted to leave, would she then want a second referendum on the terms of leaving the British Isles? the British government? That's the point I'm asking.
And I'm giving you the same answer I gave you the previous 2 times. She always wants a second referendum. She'd have wanted one whether Scotland had voted to remain or to leave. She just wants to break up the country. Now, I think that she will not hold a second referendum. If she wants one, she must have one, because she commands a majority in the Scottish Parliament. And I certainly would never oppose the Scottish people's right to hold a referendum every year if they want it. But I caution her that going too often to the well may actually not in the end be to her taste. So if and when there's a second referendum, and she proposes leaving the democratic union of Britain to join the undemocratic, anti-democratic European Union and join the euro and meet the conversion criterion, which would mean the wiping out of £12 billion worth of deficit in Scotland, I think that's a very big ask, and I think the Scottish people would say no. Thanks for the call, Dougie. Here's Brendan in the West Midlands. Go ahead, Brendan.
Hi, George.
Hi, mate.
Long-term follower. And
Thank you.
Question is coming from a position of support for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering, we all listen to you, we all love you. What is it that we could do for you to help you get back into mainstream politics? I know that there was a petition raised against the UK Parliament, which got rejected back in July, saying they wouldn't get involved in party politics. And there's a change.org petition currently up to stop you getting back in. My question really is, as forceful as a character as you are, do you want other people to get involved on your behalf?
Well, I
to get you back into Parliament.
Of course,
the Labour Party, would that be appreciated?
Well, Brendan, thank you very much. First of all, my position is clear. I will stand again for Parliament in a suitable by-election. One where I think I have a fighting chance of winning. And who knows, there might be one of those round the corner. Only God knows. Secondly, I demand that the Labour Party rescind my unjust expulsion. Now, somebody pointed out to me today that they'd been told by the Labour Party that there was a 5-year rule which would ban them from allowing me in until 5 years since the last time I stood against them. This is completely untrue, Brendan. I saw with my own eyes in front of me Tory MPs, crossing the floor, joining Labour and going straight into the government. Not one, not two, but 3, at least 3, left the Tory benches, joined the Labour benches and went straight into government. There was no 5-year rule for them. And neither is there for me. This is an affectation that is put up by people who don't want to deal with the facts. The facts are, I was expelled by Tony Blair over the Iraq War. I have been proven absolutely correct, and everything that Blair told us turned out to be a lie, and my goodness, what a damaging lie it was. So, the Labour Party needs to rescind my expulsion. At my expulsion hearing, Tony Benn, God rest him, Michael Foot, God rest him, were my character references. Jeremy Corbyn was outside the hearing demonstrating against my expulsion. So the ball is in their court, Brendan. They could do with me, frankly, they could do with me in Scotland more than they could do with anybody. They are completely bereft in Scotland.
Would you appreciate it if we got online and raised a petition to get you back in?
Yes, a petition or sending letters to Mr. Corbyn. It's not up to him, of course. It's up to the National Executive, where he doesn't have a majority, but it would strengthen him if people were landing a lot of letters in his inbox calling for that. It would certainly help me, Brendan, so I'm grateful to you for the offer. Very good of you to call. Very good of you
to raise the petition.
Yes, you're welcome to raise a petition. There have been,
and give people the address of where to go to sign up.
Yes, have you got one?
I haven't as yet. I wanted to check with you that you didn't have your own scheme in place.
No scheme. No scheme. So come back next week and tell us how it's going, will you? Brendan,
Thank you, George.
you're a gentleman. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
Craig Hall says, putting more cars on the road isn't good news. We should be offering free public transport, getting cars off the roads. Oh, Craig, give me a break. 10,000 new jobs making Jaguar Land Rovers isn't good news. What world are you living in? Shug Renix says the war criminal is the leader of Brexit in London. Nothing to do with the SNP. I think you mean the leader of Remain in London. Nothing to do with the SNP. But, Shug, you're about to learn differently. Because these 56, or it was 56, it's now rather reduced by some unfortunate circumstances, but those 50 plus SNP MPs are sitting in the Parliament in London. And Tony Blair is going to be designing the tactics to wreck Brexit. And the SNP will have to decide whether to follow him or whether to oppose him. If their Europhilia is greater than their hatred of Blair, they will follow him. And if it's the opposite, they will oppose him. Either way, Shug, it's going to be very, very embarrassing for the SNP. Trust me on that. Now, Margaret Thatcher was a gigantic figure in British politics. She changed our country forever. And no surprises, I believe she changed our country forever for the worse. But that she was a great figure cannot be gainsaid. And in one important particular, she was assisted very greatly in winning the 3 elections that she won by my next guest. I wonder if he was surprised by the cabinet papers that were released today. Let me welcome Lord Bell, Tim Bell. Lord Bell, thanks for coming on board.
Good evening, George.
Now, you're a master of presenting and a master of presentation. So how would you present the news today that actually Mrs. Thatcher wanted to be even more radical than she actually was?
Well, I don't think it's an unknown fact. I don't think it's a surprise. She was always talking about making the state much smaller, making the individual freer. So that was part of her philosophy.
Yes, but I mean, she said that the NHS was safe in her hands, all the while trying to persuade her cabinet colleagues vainly, as it turned out, to agree to a system of personal health insurance on the American model.
Yes, well, she always had a feeling that the NHS as a system would be a system we can't afford forever, which is what's being proven now. And a lot of view that a personal insurance system would be more effective.
Yes, but I mean, we were always told by her defenders that she was, whether you liked her or not, honest. But she was not being honest by saying the NHS was safe in our hands, all the while planning, trying, manoeuvring to get rid of it.
Well, I don't think that's a caricature of the situation, and not a completely accurate one. She never made any secret about her dislike of the concept of the NHS, and because she didn't understand how you can have a system whereby everybody is given free health service, no matter what their capabilities of payroll is. And she thought that a private sector health service funded by insurance policies would be a more fair and more balanced system.
Now, she was so opposed by her cabinet colleagues that Nigel Lawson tells us today that it was the nearest thing to a riot in the cabinet room. Were you aware of that at the time?
I wasn't. I didn't go to cabinet meetings. I didn't know anything about the cabinet meetings. I'm sure Nigel has a very good memory of what happened. And I'm sure he's right. Though I personally doubt there was ever anything vaguely like a riot. They
were too scared. Do you think they were too scared of her?
Probably. They were too scared to stand up for themselves that way.
Now, this is historically important for you and me, being Duncertain Ash, but it's also important contemporaneously, isn't it? Because Well, Theresa May is telling us the NHS is safe in her hands. Do you think she harbours some of the same ambitions?
Well, I don't think she is as radical as Margaret was. I don't think she thinks as deeply as Margaret does about these things, and I don't think she feels that everything we tried to achieve has been inhibited by our obsession with a free health service.
Now, now that I've got
you do realise that the NHS cannot be spoken about. I'll get murdered for saying what I'm saying. I'll get covered from Twitter from the top to the bottom, and and on Facebook from top to the bottom. But the fact is, we have a health service that we can't afford, that we offer social care and health service and pensions to millions and millions of people that we actually can't afford in the long term.
But Tim,
any insurance actuary will tell you that.
Tim, if I may call you Tim, we afforded the National Health Service in the wake of the Second World War when we were on our knees. Yes. Now we're the 6th richest country on the earth. How on earth can we not afford to give our people the best available healthcare?
We can, and there's a matter of opinion as to what the best way to deliver the most brilliant health service there is. The National Health Service is one technique of doing it. It's been reformed time and time again over the years. It's not now exactly as it was then. It used to be called a free National Health Service. It's now called free at the point of delivery. I mean, all the words get played with. And at the end of the day, it's about hospitals and nurses and doctors and operations. And if you have a health service that you make free and available to everybody, it costs you money.
Well, it does, of course. We're not short of money, Tim. We've got plenty of money. We're the 6th biggest economy in the world. Yeah. It's what we choose to do with it.
Exactly.
Do we spend it on
choices?
Yes.
And at the moment, nobody would choose to do anything with it because it's like a sacred cow. You're not allowed to speak about it.
Well, but you're right. And we wouldn't.
And yet every day, the BBC runs a story how the health service let somebody down, how something hasn't worked at the health service, how the doctors aren't doing this, the nurses aren't doing that, the midwives aren't doing that. That's run every single day. There's a story on the BBC saying that. And then the following week, there's a story on the BBC saying the opposite is the case. The National Health Service hasn't got enough money. We haven't got enough funding for this. Haven't got enough funding for that. Haven't got enough funding for anything. It's a bottomless coffee pot.
Well, was it the same thought process that was also revealed in these papers that led her to wish to challenge the principle of free and universal education, introducing charges into the education system? Was it born of the same dogma?
I think probably it was. Her view would be, if you can afford to do something, you should pay for it. If you can't afford to, you need to be helped. Yeah,
but of course that's a recipe for a first and second class service, isn't it? In both health and education.
That's your opinion.
It's a matter of logic, isn't it?
Well, it may be logical, I don't know. That depends on the attitude of the people involved in either service. If it creates a two-tier system, it creates a two-tier system. And what people should aspire to is to move from one tier to another tier.
And would you advocate now, let's just go nap on Twitter and Facebook, Tim, would you advocate now that Theresa May return to the Thatcher dogma on these matters?
I wouldn't call it dogma, because I think it means something else. I think it's a radical view of how to use public expenditure and how to make sure that most people in the country prosper. And I think it's a perfectly acceptable view. It's something that if the mood were right, I would push. But the mood isn't right, so you can't push it.
So your affection for the Iron Lady is undimmed after all these decades?
Absolutely, completely undimmed. I cannot think of any problem this country's faced, particularly Brexit, that she wouldn't have faced absolutely square in the jaw and done what was necessary.
Now, you were elevated, if that's the word, to the House of Lords by Tony Blair. Are you happy that he's coming back onto the field?
No, I'm certainly not happy. I think it's a very stupid idea. He'll discover that most people can't stand him, don't like his opinions and don't agree with him, and regard him as pretty much a complete failure. There's those people who suffered from the Iraq War, There's those who suffered from the grossly inflated public expenditure that happened under Brown, and there's those people who were given false hope of things that we couldn't afford and were never going to deliver, and so now he comes along with another list of hopes and wishes and promises which he can't keep, and it'll be doom.
So you think he'll
isn't elected or anything?
You think he'll damage? Well, I think he'll probably be joining you soon, Tim, in the Lords. Do you think he'll damage the Remain campaign?
I think he's done terrible damage to them, and I think John Major's done the same thing. I mean, they are both people who don't accept a democratic decision and pretend they accept it and then try and do the opposite.
Well, we've found a rare moment of agreement on that. Tim Bell, Lord Bell, thank you very much for joining us. Advisor to...
As much as you think.
Okay, thanks a lot, mate. Tim Bell, advisor to Margaret Thatcher for 3 successful election campaigns. And lovely Norma in Bristol. Let's hear from her.
Hello, George.
Norma, welcome.
Hello.
What would you like to say?
Well, I just wanted to get rid of my anger and my opinion of Tony Blair, and the best way to do it is to ring you.
Yes, of course. It's an open door, Norma.
Well, you know, I mean, I actually think he's what you call a megalomaniac, which is, he thinks he's got a private line to God and is on a mission. And actually, that is a bit of a mental illness. And we don't want any second coming. The thing is, I marched against the Iraq War in London with thousands of others, and I stood with CND on Wednesday night vigils at the Bristol City Centre. And I mean, it was a terrible war. And we all know there weren't any weapons now of mass destruction. But Iraq's still in a bad way. And he's got too much blood on his hands. I mean, to be honest, he's just got to sort of have the humility to take a back seat. We do not want him. Go away.
Well, humility and Tony Blair don't belong in the same sentence, as you know. But here's the point. You're right, he is a megalomaniac, messianic, and unstable. I believe mentally unstable. But he has the support on the Brexit issue of all of Britain's ruling elite, the big business, the big bankers, the big newspaper owners, the BBC, and a bloc in Parliament, hundreds of MPs strong, and a bloc in the Lords, hundreds of Lords strong. So what he's trying to do is rehabilitate himself whilst bringing about the ruin of Brexit. And if he were to succeed in that, the next stop would be President of the European Union. So we'd finally have to call him Mr. President.
It's not,
that's the game. That's the game.
Yeah, but it's a very big worry. And I think there would be an awful lot. I don't want to be a person of hate. But I'd march against him. I can't stand the man. Sorry.
Well, I agree with Lord Bell that actually he will act as a major disruptor of the Remain camp.
Yeah.
Many people who support Remain will not be prepared to follow him into the lobbies and follow him onto the streets. That's my own view, Norma.
Yeah, I think you might well be right there, George, yeah.
So I'm actually quite keen on him leading the Remain campaign. But it is a risk. Norma, thanks for the call. Tom is up next in Gloucestershire. Tom, welcome back.
Hello, George.
Yes,
compelling listening as ever.
Thank you.
Yes, I think most of the problems we're facing now as a country can be traced back to Mrs. Thatcher, to be honest with you.
Yeah, me too.
She knocked the guts out of our industry, and that was our means of earning our way in the world. Manufacturing dropped by 30% under her, and it dropped 30% under Tony Blair.
She destroyed more of our manufacturing capacity than the Luftwaffe did in World War II.
The trouble is, we can't build it back up again now. We could when the Luftwaffe came in, because we could rebuild factories and get them up and running. But when you just bulldoze them over, that's it. But she deregulated the financial sector with big bang. She took away a lot of the checks and balances that were brought in after the Wall Street crash to stop that ever happening again. She gave the people the impression that we were doing well, but in reality it was just a fire sale of national assets. As Harold Macmillan said, you're selling the family silver. And then when Tony Blair and Gordon Brown came in, they realised that the only means of paying the bills was to cozy up to the financial sector and turned a blind eye to the greed and to the irresponsibility that was going on there. And as the years rolled by, as we all know, it went bang, and it went bang spectacularly. And as a result, we didn't have our industry, our earning capacity to fall back on, and that's why we have been in this mess that we've been in since 2008. And there's a lot of talk this week about the jams, the people who are just about managing. And I was only thinking this week, if the jams had been in charge of the national budget, they would have probably have kept it in balance, because the just about managing people, if they overspend or if they don't sort their finances out correctly, it means that they'll be out on the streets or there'll be no food on the table. With the politicians, they have a play at the game, and then when it goes wrong, they disappear. They go to the city, they go to the House of Lords, they go out like Tony Blair has, selling speeches all over the place, and then the jams are still there, still trying to make ends meet with a new lot of politicians in charge. And I come from a farming community. We will never ever forget Tony Blair. It's not very often talked about now, but the foot and mouth disaster in 2001 was an unmitigated disaster. Depending on what report you read, it cost the nation £6 to £8 billion, and as a result, the countryside was shut up for a year and a half. There was no tuberculosis testing going on, so ever since then, that epidemic has done further damage to the livestock and cattle industry. And he got involved. They killed 4,000 sheep round here at Easter Bank Holiday 2001 and 400 cattle, and not one of them tested positive for the disease. It was sheer and utter incompetence, and the farming community will never ever forget Tony Blair for that. And I feel like the miners felt with Mrs. Thatcher. She decimated their industry, and Tony Blair did his fair share of decimating our industry as well.
Tom, that's the best call of the night by a distance. So let me just press you on one point. Lord Bell demurred at the idea that Mrs. Thatcher's ideas were dogma. But surely dogma is precisely what they were. The free market dogma that believed that nothing that could possibly be sold should be in the public sector, that those who had the money to pay for schools and pay for medical treatment should do so. This dogma came from across the Atlantic, from Friedman, from Hayek, from the Chicago School of Economists, and it was surely a free market dogma which has never actually been revoked here in Britain, certainly wasn't revoked by Tony Blair.
Well, we were supposed to be, in Mrs. Thatcher's eyes, a shareholding democracy and a property-owning democracy. Well, as we all know, most of our utilities that were sold off are now owned by foreign countries and governments, etc. Property ownership, well, that's virtually impossible now, despite having interest rates at the lowest level in history. And it just hasn't worked, George. It just hasn't worked.
Well, I drove past Scotland Yard this evening, which is now all boarded up and sold off. Our fire stations, our police stations sold off. Our Royal Mail still in the hands of the Royals, just not the British Royals. It's now the Kuwaiti Royal Mail. Our post boxes, our telephone boxes, all the things that were Britain have gone, and all carried out by people who were never done waving the British flag.
Finally, on the Brexit side of things, Tony Blair getting involved with that, well, I thought the other day, if the vote had gone the other way and Remain had won 52 to 48, would Mr Cameron and Mr Osborne have given any concessions whatsoever to the Leave voters? No, they wouldn't. They would have said, we've had the vote, we're staying in the EU, forget it, and we've got to move on. And all these people trying to knock holes and trying to dismantle the process are doing huge damage to the confidence of business and the country. I think the government have really got to start saying we've got to prioritise British goods and services.
Yes, I don't know why they're not. I interviewed Peter Lilly yesterday for my TV show on Saturday, and I was making the point to him that they need to be busy not just Brexiting, they have to be busy setting out the alternative. Buy British, invest in things that we are the leaders in, whether they are cultural or industrial or scientific or medical. This alternative Britain has to be being sketched now, and it just isn't by the Theresa May government. They're just drifting.
And all these people who are insisting on parliamentary votes now are the very people who campaigned for the EU with all of its anti-democratic processes, and now they've all become Democrats again.
Yeah, well, there's actually no contradiction. They hate democracy. That's why they loved the EU. Tom in Gloucestershire, thank you for an excellent call. Let me take some tweets. David Outerside says Blair's ego, which comes before everything he touches, would like the idea of President Blair very much. John B.S. says President Blair is a dreadful thought, George. I would rather put up with Maggie May. And Nat Kimber says if Tony Blair is coming back, George, I'm moving to the States. Trump over Blair any day, he says. And York's Lass says when Tony Blair in charge of the UK Labour Party, it was in serious debt. Miliband and Corbyn has put it into credit. And Sean Caden in Australia says it will certainly be nice and warm where the wicked destroyer of society Margaret Thatcher is now with her mate Jimmy Savile. This is a text. I didn't know Scotland had a vote for the referendum. I thought it was a UK vote. That's from Kevin. And Dougs McAuliffe says Major was a decent bloke. Blair was far worse. Brian Patterson says Thatcher destroyed a generation of youth. Indeed she did. And Jeff Blackie says, George, I see this present Tory regime potentially far worse than Thatcher. Well, Morgan Baker, one last one. I regretted my vote for them. I see how truly divisive the SNP are. Well, divisive is their middle name. That's their purpose, to divide the working people in a small island, in a small world. This is the mother of all talk shows, with me, George Galloway, on Talk Radio. Elvis Costello, the ultimate troubadour of the Thatcher years, a burst of a decade of musical genius, productivity unmatched, hit after hit after hit. And of course, Mrs. Thatcher is back from the grave. Thanks to the 30-year rule, we now know. And we knew from Lord Bell in a previous interview this evening, she did indeed fully intend, because she believed that there shouldn't be a national health service and there shouldn't be private education. She fully planned, if she could have got it past her cabinet colleagues who knew the vegetables were capable of standing up to her, she would have done it. Now, somebody else who's come back from the political grave in the last week is Tony Blair, announcing that he will be announcing in the new year a new political project designed to stop Brexit, or at the very least to force a second referendum in order to stop Brexit. So let's hear from a former special advisor to Tony Blair, Matthew Doyle, whom I'm grateful for joining us. Matthew, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, George.
Are you able to give us any tantalising hint as to what this new formula might be, what this new bloc might look like?
Well, I think it's about more than just Brexit specifically. It's about looking at how we can reinvigorate the political debate in this country, because there are a whole chunk of people who principally make up the 48% who voted for Remain, who feel at the moment that their voice isn't really being heard in this debate. Now, no question about it, the Remainers lost. They lost fair and square, but that doesn't mean that 48% should be without a voice or without anyone representing them in the discussions that go forward. And Tony Blair, as a passionate pro-European, wants to do everything that he can to ensure that we get the best possible route out of that.
I'm not sure there's a lack of vigorous debate in this country. It seems sometimes on social media to be rather too vigorous at times. Elected politicians are there arguing the different sides. This seems to imply that Mr. Blair thinks the elected politicians are not quite up to the job.
Well, I think it would be true to say that he's got criticisms of the Labour Party at the moment in terms of the way in which it hasn't robustly come out and set out a pro-European position. It hasn't seemed to have a clear position between whether it's what you listen to hear from Keir Starmer or John McDonnell or Jeremy Corbyn. There have been disagreements there, and I don't think that that's helpful in this debate. And what we need to do is focus on Brexit as the short-term issue, but more broadly, how is it that we do reinvigorate the centre-left? And obviously he'll have very different views to you on that, but that's fair enough. That's part of having a robust political debate in this country.
He obviously has ambitions to involve people in other parties. You yourself said the 48%. Now, the 48% are Conservatives, they are Liberal Democrats, they are Scottish Nationalists, and they are Labour people. Does he want to create a de facto bloc of these people inside the political system?
No, what he wants is those people voting Labour at the next election, because what they see is a Labour Party.
Are you sure about that, Matthew?
Of course. Look, what does Tony Blair want? Tony Blair wants to see a Labour government, and his view is that the only way that you'll get that is by a Labour Party that moves back from the position that it's in at the moment and actually takes more of a centre ground position, the centre ground sort of position that saw us win 3 election victories when he was the leader of the party. And that continues to be his view as to how a party of the centre-left can win in Britain.
How come he's able to command the support of so many rich and powerful people for this pro-Labour project?
Because I think there is still a chunk of public opinion, of business opinion and so on, that wants to do everything that it can to see whether there is another course that we can go on. Now, in all probability, Brexit is going to happen, but there is also the possibility that the public will turn around and say, well, hang on a minute, you gave us all of these assurances that actually, because Germans will still want to sell us their cars or because the French will still want us to buy their cheese, that it would all be fine and we'd have access to the single market and so on. Well, if it turns out that those reassurances aren't correct, then it's perfectly legitimate that the public might want to turn around and say, well, hang on a minute, we want to have another think about this.
Yeah, but of course, if you leave open the possibility of having another think about it, that encourages the strongest possible negotiating position inside the EU, doesn't it? If they can make it as ugly as possible, there's a better chance that the think again about it will be a vote to overturn the original decision.
To be honest, I think that position is inevitable anyway. I think if you look at the concerns that the European Union has got, whether it's with the five-star movement in Italy, whether it's with the moves that there are in the Netherlands to have a sort of referendum, I think it's guaranteed that the European Union is going to do all that it can to show that the freedoms that come with membership of the European Union can't become an a la carte menu. They are a fixed set. And I think so I just think that's an inevitable part of how this is going to play out.
Now, you say, Matthew, you in fact explicitly stated that Mr. Blair wants to see a Labour victory at the next general election, but that's not really true, is it? Because he said that not only did he think that Jeremy Corbyn's politics would not win an election, but that they should not win an election. That was an act of treason, wasn't it?
No, it wasn't. What it was an act of is him being totally honest about his view as to both Jeremy's ability to secure the support of the public to be Prime Minister and the policy prescriptions that he comes forward with. Because ultimately what Tony Blair's making in that point is, this isn't just about the personality. It's not just some personal animosity towards Jeremy Corbyn. It's that he fundamentally disagrees with the political approach that Jeremy is taking. Now, obviously, that will get tested at a general election, but his view is that if we go into that election with Jeremy as leader, i.e. with the policy platform that Jeremy represents, then ultimately we will be unsuccessful again in that election, as we were under Ed Miliband at the last election. And so therefore what we need...
And that Labour should be unsuccessful. You're missing out the second part of the statement. Not only would Corbyn's politics be defeated, but they should be defeated.
Yeah, because I don't think some of Jeremy's policies, whether it's his views on NATO or whether it's his views on the economy or whether it's his views on public services, are in the best interest of the country.
Well, that's a fair enough point of view. There's a lot of people. There's a lot of people with that point of view, Matthew. But you can't say that if you think Labour should be defeated, if it puts forward Corbyn's policy platform, you can't say that you're intent on winning a Labour victory unless you intend that Corbyn should be overthrown before the general election.
Well, look, that's a decision above my pay grade, and that's a matter for, the party as a whole to take. But what's certainly true is that Tony Blair is not... If you're trying to get to a point where you suggest that somehow Tony Blair is going to be campaigning for a different party to win the next election, or a new party to win the next election, that I don't believe will be the case. What I do think is the case is that he's been very clear about the type of Labour Party that can win an election. And that isn't to say it's just a carbon copy of everything that he did. The world's moved on. We've had the financial crisis and so on. However, it does need to recognise the fundamentals of how a party of the centre-left wins in Britain, and that is when it's trusted on the economy, when it's being seen as supportive of business, when it's got a coalition that includes the north and the south of the country, and when it's trusted on defence. Those fundamentals haven't changed. They were true for Tony Blair, for Harold Wilson, for Clement Attlee.
Well, we mentioned earlier the rich and powerful people who were gathered in a very fancy restaurant the other night and talked to by both Mr. Campbell and Mr. Mandelson, Lord Mandelson. It's clear that something big is in the offing. It's denied now, but was said to the Sunday Times that Mr. Blair considered Jeremy Corbyn a nutter and Theresa May a lightweight. I think objectively, logically, that seems to be the logic which lies behind this move. So let me just ask you this one final question.
Sure.
Do you think that anybody outside of the rich and powerful, in the public, really want to hear more from Tony Blair after the Chilcot report, after the disaster that the Iraq war has become?
Look, I get that for some people, and I'm sure you're one of them, George, in one sense, that what happened with the Iraq War is something that basically means it's a bar to listening to what Tony Blair says on any other subject. I actually think that the majority view is that whatever people think of the Iraq War, they also recognise that this is someone who was a successful Prime Minister of this country for a decade. He's got useful experience to have in this European debate. And just as we've seen John Major weighing in today on a similar line as well, that it would be sensible to listen to former prime ministers who've got the experience of conducting these sorts of new European negotiations. Because let's be honest about it, the government certainly doesn't look like it's doing a good job of it at the moment.
Well, you've got a different inbox to me if you think that there are a lot of people want to set aside the Chilcot report and listen anyway to what Mr. Blair has to say. I suppose, to coin another restaurant phrase, the proof of that pudding will be in the eating. I'm grateful to you, Matthew, for coming on the show. Matthew Doyle,
thank you.
Former special advisor to Tony Blair. Just magnificent. What an artist. What a songwriter. What a singer. What a performer. I may be the biggest fan of Elvis Costello on these islands. A truly unique and magnificent talent. Now, coming up later in the programme, we've got John Le Boutillier on Trump and whether or not Nigel Farage is moving to the United States. And if he does, what position might he be offered at the feet in Trump Towers? Because that's where the White House is relocating. If you're following these things, he's not going to move into the White House, you know. He's going to stay in Trump Towers, which is going to be surrounded by a division of the US military in order to protect him. We're playing Elvis Costello because we're remembering the Thatcher era, because Mrs. Thatcher has come back from the grave with the release of new papers that show, and Lord Bell, her maestro, confirmed it this evening, that she wanted to ditch the National Health Service and replace it with an insurance-based scheme, and to end free education in Britain, because she said we couldn't afford it. Unique Mind says the whole of Britain knows and hates Tony Blair. Well, Matthew Doyle doesn't think that. Christor McCarthy says stop paying 400 and odd million to the Royals' home improvements, stop bombing other countries, invest in the UK. And Invictus says thank you, our country needs Blair now. Yeah, like it needs the return of the Black Death. Let's hear from David in Glasgow. On you go, David.
Hello, how you doing, George?
I'm good, nice to hear from you.
First of all, I do agree with most of your philosophy regarding politics, and you were one of only a few persons who actually had the backbone to attack the illegal activity of Tony Blair.
Indeed.
And you should be commended for that.
Thank you.
However,
I hear a but coming. There's a but coming, David.
However, I cannot agree with you on the European Union.
Okay.
You understand? These Brexiteers appear to be patriots, and undisciplined patriots at that. And you know that patriotism is the last refuge of the scoundrel.
Indeed.
I think people should be internationalist in outlook, be it UK internationalist or EU internationalist. But I do not believe that one portion of a state should dictate to other portions of a state what they can and cannot do. So for that reason, if England wants to leave the European Union, it can, but it will have to leave the UK first.
Well,
and
no,
that's my point.
it was a British vote on whether or not to leave, and 1 million Scottish people voted to leave. Of course, they were in a minority in Scotland. They were in a majority in other places. You can't say that Sunderland can leave the EU, but Rotherham remain. It was a British vote. In fact, it was a United Kingdom vote. I'm not a person who uses that terminology, United Kingdom. I'm not in favour of kingdoms, and I'm not in favour of Ireland remaining divided, but that's another matter. The point is, it was one vote for one state on whether that state should stay or go from the European Union. Now, if you're saying to me, David, that the SNP, and I can sense from my Twitter feed, they're very anxious about this point, is going to follow Tony Blair's campaign to remain in the European Union, and is going to argue to leave Britain and only apply to join the EU, accept the euro, accept the convergence criterion, make the swinging cuts of 12 or 13 billion pounds in Scotland's budget. If you think the Scots will vote for that, I think you've got another think coming, Dave.
Are you going to allow me to address that point, yes?
Of course, that's why I've gone silent.
Yeah, well, first of all, right, the Scottish people voted to remain within the United Kingdom. We have to respect the free people of Scotland. We are a free people. We are not subjected. As you know, we joined the United Kingdom as a free people, and we can leave at any time.
Yes, but you haven't left yet, David.
We also voted to remain, right, but as a free people.
David,
right,
look, I'll let you back in a minute, David, but as a matter of simple logic, I'm sorry I've got to put it this way, that's just total nonsense. Scotland freely joined the United Kingdom, and it can freely leave. It can leave any time. As far as I'm concerned, it could try every year to have a referendum to leave. But it recently had a referendum in which it decided to stay. And one of the consequences of staying is that the British state remained and is one political entity and that entity held a referendum on whether or not to leave the European Union, and that entity voted to leave.
No, right. That entity is a union of 4 peoples, 4 nations, right? And all peoples and all
Northern
nations
Ireland isn't a nation, by the way. So, I mean, as a matter of logic,
listen,
again, look, again, again, as a matter, David, as a matter of logic, that just ain't true. Wales voted to leave. England voted to leave.
I didn't say. Listen, I didn't say that Wales voted to remain. What I'm saying
You're
is,
talking about 4 peoples.
The United, four peoples.
But
right?
those 4 peoples, David, those 4 peoples are members of one state. And until you leave that state, I'm afraid you are bound by the decisions of that state.
At the point of devolution, Scotland became its own state.
No, Doc. Now you're being off you go. Now you're being stupid. At the point of devolution, Scotland became its own state. David, I expected better, given the stentorian way in which you spoke. Here's James in London on Blair. Go ahead, James.
Hi, George. How's it going?
Good, thanks. Better for hearing from you. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I just think that the reason Tony Blair keeps intervening in current affairs, even though he really doesn't have and shouldn't have a platform, is that it's just another act to destabilise Corbyn, which I don't think the British people are going to go for, to be honest. What do you think of that?
No, it's certainly about dethroning Corbyn. He made it very clear. And Matthew didn't deal with that because there's no way of dealing with it. He said that Corbyn wouldn't be elected and shouldn't be elected.
Yes, well, exactly.
So at that point, I don't know why he wasn't expelled from the Labour Party.
Well, exactly. The other thing is, do you think Corbyn would win a snap election? Because that's been like a massive issue at the moment, whether, if it was held, whether he could boot Theresa May out. Do you think he'd win?
Well, first of all, I don't think there's going to be a snap election, but if you're asking me in the abstract, I believe that Labour has a chance to win the general election. I believe it has damaged itself over the Brexit issue, being neither one thing nor the other, and walking down the middle of the road runs the risk of being knocked down by the traffic going in both directions. But Theresa May is a useless Prime Minister, a waste of space. Her government is drifting. They have tripled the deficit. Their autumn statement was an absolute shambles and disgrace. So if Labour could get its act together, yes, it could win an election.
Yeah, well, I just think, I'll just part on this point. If Labour won't have you and Ken, but they'll have Tony Blair and Alistair Campbell, it's an absolute shambles, George.
You're right, I'm afraid it is, and it's getting late. The hour is getting late, Jamesy. Thanks for your call, my friend. Ken02 says Tories feared revolution in 1945, and so did Attlee. The NHS was a useful way of releasing pressure. And Balder the Braves come back for more. These old Tories make me sick. Only this week we had Ken Clark saying jams was made up to sway the autumn statement. And Sean says we must always remember why the NHS was formed. By the great Mr. Bevan and Mr. Attlee. Free at the point of delivery. And Ford says, I grew up under Thatcher. All our problems we're having now are down to her. And Nicola says, she laid the building blocks for what's happening now. Any news regarding the Tory election expenses fraud? I've not been following that, Nicola, but I think Channel 4 returned to it in the week, so you can maybe Google that. I do think that's an issue that's going to come back and haunt them. Nicola goes on, I knew ages ago she wanted to remove Social Security from people. If people are prepared to starve the miners back to work, well, what else are they capable of? Now, is Nigel Farage going to be the British ambassador in Washington? I must say the excuse given that there's no vacancy doesn't hold a lot of water for me. Who knows who the British ambassador in Washington is? Who cares? Certainly not the Americans. Whoever that ambassador is, he or she, I have no idea, is certainly not making very much of an impact, unlike Nigel Farage, I suspect. Or maybe Mr. Farage is going to become a US citizen and become the US ambassador to London. If you had a mischievous streak, that would be even more entertaining. Or perhaps he could be the US ambassador to the European Union in Brussels. That too would set the cat amongst the pigeons. Is he going to live there because he thinks he'd get less public attention there? I would have thought that an unlikely outcome. But certainly Mr. Trump is lining up a whole chamber of horrors as his chief advisors and his appointees, not all of whom will come to pass. Presumably some of them are kites flown to frighten us, and indeed they certainly have. The idea of John Bolton as the Secretary of State, effectively the Foreign Secretary of the United States, is enough to frighten the horses everywhere, and would certainly completely negate his campaign pledge to make better relations with Russia, to have less US war in the world. John Bolton would not be satisfied until he'd gone to war with practically every country in the world. And some of the people that he has gathered around him in what is the new White House, the golden tower to vulgarity, Trump Towers, are enough to frighten me, never mind the horses. But there's a new angle on the table. Dr. Jill Stein, whom I supported throughout the campaign, has launched a fundraising drive to demand a recount in those swing states, the post-industrial states that Trump won and therefore won the presidency. And the last time I looked, she had raised millions of dollars in 24, 36, 48 hours, something like that. So, is there a possibility that even at this stage we could be looking at something even more frightening, namely the resurrection of a President Hillary Clinton? That would be a comeback from the grave, just like Margaret Thatcher's today, just like Tony Blair's prospective comeback early in the new year. We'll be talking to John Le Boutillier, the former US Republican congressman, who talks us through with that honeyed voice these matters when we talk to him, as we do regularly. Just trying to get him up on the line now. Let me read some of the tweets while I'm waiting. Tegwin Half says, by closing the coal mines, Thatcher also destroyed the main employment in my village. And indeed, many villages too. David Pearce says, Blair for me is the worst of the lot. He betrayed the people that voted for him because they needed help and killed them. Crystal says, we can afford the NHS. They just tell us we can't. Their pockets are deeper than the Mariana Trench. What is the Mariana Trench, by the way? Simon Brian Anderson says, I firmly believe the NHS budget is plenty if managed correctly. How many millions go to staff agencies? It's a joke. Well, it isn't plenty. We need far more spent on our healthcare. We spend far less than France does, for example. John Lipnicki says, but most of the wealth is in a few hands, and they do not wish to share it. Michael O'Neill says, Blair is an imposter, a Tory in Labour clothes. And J.D. says, George, please don't exaggerate. Scotland will still do what it needs to do. Well, J.D., you are one of many Scottish nationalists that are tweeting me now since I made the point I made earlier. I'm the first, I think, to make this point, and perhaps I'm the best placed to make it. The SNP are about to face the mother of all dilemmas. The leader of blocking Brexit is about to be Tony Blair. The SNP are going to have to make a decision as to whether they're going to follow Tony Blair's blocking of Brexit or whether they're going to accept that Brexit is what people voted for. If, as I suspect, they choose to get into bed with Tony Blair, well, they're going to look rather differently from the pose they seek to strike at Westminster and in Scotland in front of the public. I'm not exaggerating this, JD. Just think about what I am saying. They are going to be in bed with Tony Blair. They're going to be singing from the same hymn sheet as Tony Blair. How is that going to look and sound? Well, I was in Scotland, all over the place, in the last few days, in Glasgow, in Clackmannanshire, in Aberdeen. I've got to tell you that this is a real and present problem for the SNP, and it is about to get even more problematic, because the SNP came to power, partly, maybe even largely, as a revulsion against Labour because of the Blair era. And now the SNP are getting back into bed with him. Let me turn now to the sage, John Le Boutillier, to look at these Trump matters. Are you there, John?
Of course I am, George. I'm always here for you. I've never said no to George Galloway, because we're going to be roommates on the 20th of January.
Well, yes. Well, if Jill Stein's efforts to scupper it all don't come to pass. So let me ask you about that in the first place. She's raised millions of dollars in not even 3 days, I think, and she intends to enter legal actions to try and have the votes recounted in the swing states. Is this a stunt or a real possibility in your view?
Well, okay, let's clarify. It's to recount the votes in 3 states, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, all of which were very close. And the argument is this, that in places where they used a paper ballot, the polling before the election and the results of that election were almost dead on accurate. But in states where there were electronic voting machines with no paper record, Trump did much better after they voted the count of the votes than he did in the polling going right into the election itself. So there's apparently some sort of discrepancy in the places with the electronic machines. Now, the issue is, why is that? And is it because of foreign hacking into the electronic voting machines? We don't know. But she needed to have the money to file for those recounts by 5 o'clock today. It's now 11 minutes after 4. She has the money. She will get the recounts underway. Now, who knows what's going to happen? The odds are very unlikely that she could overturn 3 states. But who knows? Funnier things might have happened.
So we're back to hanging chads and electronic voting discrepancies. This will create the mother of all political crises in your country, wouldn't it?
It would if they found anything. I mean, let's just ask a general question of ourselves. Is it conceivable, I'm just going to say hypothetically, that Vladimir Putin would meddle in the counting of votes in America? Is that conceivable? And I think any objective person would say, yes, it is. That guy's capable. If he's going to murder his opponents, murder critical reporters, why couldn't he say to his people, go ahead. If you can screw up the election, go do it. He clearly favored Trump over Hillary in the leaking to WikiLeaks. All the stuff that was leaked out was anti-Hillary. They never leaked out anything that hurt Trump. So there's a motive, and there's an evil guy out there, Vladimir Putin, who would theoretically do it. I could see it. So then comes the issue of, did he do it? And we're not going to know. We're not going to know until this thing's done. And I don't know if we'll ever know who did the hacking, if there was hacking. I'm sure it's done to hide it. He has cutouts do it.
This is a massive story, John, isn't it? Because the trumpeters are fairly, how shall I put it, boisterous people. Mm-hmm. If their man was robbed, by a legal action of the presidency,
oh my God,
there'd be civil war in your country.
This is nothing but trouble. But let me just say, George, for months leading up to the election, there was talk of foreign hacking screwing up the voting, screwing up the counting of the votes. This is not something we hadn't heard of. I think this is the natural follow-on to it. And some apparently credible professors in Michigan and Wisconsin, looking at these numbers, came up with not who did the hacking. We don't know who did it. But they have found a discrepancy, as I said, between electronic machines and paper ballots. There's something odd went on there.
And how is Trump responding to this?
No comment.
Okay. Let me turn then to the other angle, which is the somewhat grisly cast of characters that he appears to be considering assembling as his chiefs of staff and as his chief policy advisors and his attorney general and head of the CIA and so on. Some pretty frightening people there, in my view.
Let me go backwards. The latest appointee announced or leaked out today as Deputy National Security Advisor. I'm just giving you this one first, George, because of my own personal involvement in it. It's a woman called K.T. McFarland, who, like I am, is on Fox TV. But here's why I bring it up, because it sort of angers me. For years on radio shows, K.T. McFarland would tell people on the air, George, oh, I used to go out with John LeBoutelier. And I would hear this, and I go, what the hell is she talking about? I've never met this woman. I don't even know her, right? So finally, in the mid-2000s, I do meet her out here where I live on Long Island. She's running for the U.S. Senate. And I go up to her before her speech, and I said, KT, I'm John LeBoutelier. Nice to finally meet you. We've never met before, and we've never gone out. And you've got to stop saying it. She gets up, they introduce her, she gets up on the stage, she says, oh, thank you, everybody, I love being out here in Long Island. I just saw my old friend backstage, John LeBoutelier. We used to go out together.
My goodness.
Yeah, and she went to...
By the way, John, that kind of thing happens to me a lot.
But you did go out with her.
So she's the latest. She's now the Deputy National Security Advisor.
That's right.
Wow. Tell us some of the other in the chamber of horrors that we keep reading about.
Okay, I don't think the chief of staff is bad. Reince Priebus was head of the Republican Party. He's not a horror. But this guy Steve Bannon allegedly is a white nationalist.
Yeah.
Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General nominee, senator from Alabama. Allegations of racial bias.
Well, he wasn't even allowed to be a federal judge because of that very point. So how can he be the Attorney General if he wasn't good enough to be a federal judge?
Well, we'll see if he can get confirmed or not. You know, there's some jobs the cabinet jobs you have to be confirmed by the U.S. Senate. Jobs on the White House staff, like the one KT just got, and Bannon and all, they don't have to be confirmed. Oh, the National Security Advisor, he's a real peach. This guy, General Michael Flynn, he's big for Putin.
I met him in Moscow, by the way.
There you go. Well, maybe you're big for Putin, too.
I am. I'm just not arguing with you on that point.
Okay. Is Vladimir going to come down to our beach house in New Zealand and hang out with us?
No comment. Now, look, some of these chaps, and indeed women, are just being flown as kites, aren't they? I mean, John Bolton cannot be a serious contender to be
sort of
Secretary of State.
I think they just hang it up there. I don't think he's it. I think the big fight at the moment is for Secretary of State. That's the number one cabinet.
That's the only one that matters to me, candidly, because, frankly, the Americans can do what they like inside their own state, even if I have a negative view of it. But the Secretary of State will be the international spearhead of American foreign policy. So I have a very intense interest in that. Who do you think's going to get that gig?
I think we really don't know because there's a fight going on between among Trump people over whether to pick Rudy Giuliani, the former mayor of New York City, who was the early favorite, but overplayed his hand and apparently ticked off Trump a little bit by overdoing it in the press right after the election in a very arrogant way. And so Trump said, let's bring some other people in, and they brought in Mitt Romney last Saturday and talked to him. Apparently it went very well. They liked each other. They got along well.
I never thought I'd say that I'm praying for Mitt Romney, the Mormon candidate last time out, but I am actually praying for him.
But he's not a buddy of your friend Vladimir Putin. He warned that he's the most dangerous man in the world. So,
yeah, but he'll do what Trump tells him to do. Bolton is a much more dangerous guy. But never mind what he said about Vladimir Putin. What he said about Trump was that Trump was a phony, that his candidature had no more credibility than a university degree from the Trump University. How did they manage to get on well together, given what Romney had said about him?
Because I don't think Trump, I really say this with sincerity to you, George, I think Trump is a very odd duck. That nothing Trump has said in the past means anything. And therefore, anybody who says anything about Trump means nothing. He's an odd creature. So he doesn't care that Romney trashed him last spring. He can move on from that because he doesn't, I don't know, his mind just doesn't absorb it the same. And similarly, everything Trump says about every issue, look at, he's already reversing himself. He's already reversed himself on waterboarding. He's in the middle of reversing himself on global climate change, whether it's man-made or not.
And on the lock her up. He's no longer going to lock her up.
That's right. He's not going to get near that, as I predicted on TV that he wouldn't and shouldn't and couldn't. And, you know, I don't know how many other things, but he'll revert. This guy will say something today, and tomorrow it's as if he never said it. That's how he's always been.
Okay, a last point, John, because we're running out of time. I need to go to some capitalist messages in a minute.
Oh, how horrible, George. So you would have to pay some bills.
Now, much of the British coverage in recent days has been about Nigel Farage, the leader of the anti-EU party, UKIP. Now, he's well in with Trump. He helped Trump in the election. He was one of the first to be received at Trump Towers. And there's talk, well, never mind talk, Trump officially stated that Farage should be the British ambassador to Washington, which was an unusual stand where countries choose other countries' ambassadors. Maybe he'll have some views on what our cabinet should look like. But is there any possibility? Do people in America know Nigel Farage? Are they waiting for him?
Couldn't care less. He is coming back to see the Trump transition team next month or next week, maybe it's December in Washington. And I wonder if Trump is thinking of hiring Farage for something if he's not the ambassador. If I were Prime Minister May, I would not make him the ambassador, specifically for the reason that if the President of the United States starts pushing me around and saying, I think this guy should be the ambassador, then my initial reaction is then he won't be the ambassador. You got to stand up and say, I decide these things.
Yeah. Of course. So he might hire him. What might he hire him as?
I have no idea. So that's the type of thing you have no clue. He could be an advisor on European affairs or something. I really don't know what he's up to. I mean, Trump is weird. None of this makes any sense. And I'm back for a second on the Secretary of State thing. It's a crucial job, and we have to have someone in the room. When they make foreign policy, you're going to have Trump, you're going to have Flynn, the security advisor, the Secretary of Defense, and the Secretary of State. Now, those two jobs haven't been filled, but they've got to have an adult who knows policy, who knows history, who knows alliances, because Trump and Flynn don't. And I think it's going to be a real problem if they pick some sycophant to be Secretary of State who's going to be making the foreign policy? Who's deciding these things?
And therefore, are you leaning towards Romney?
Actually, the guy that I think, and I still think, I wouldn't be surprised if it's neither Romney nor Giuliani. I think it could be someone like Bob Corker, the senator from Tennessee who's head of the Foreign Relations Committee, who knows these issues inside out, who's very reasonable. Because they need a reasonable person in the room to look at Trump and say, Donald, you can't do that. Here's what's going to work, and here's what's not going to work. You can't do what you're trying to do.
Well, I'm not sure what Trump would respond to
Me
that.
neither. I don't know.
Well, John, I've never gone out with you, but I love you, and I'm really glad
too,
that you're with us.
Too.
Thanks
We're
a
going
lot.
to do great. We're going to do great down in New Zealand together.
You're right.
Get Putin to come down for a long weekend.
Yes, indeed. Okay, thanks very much. John Laboutier, the sage from the United States. And now Laura in London disagrees with John Laboutier, so we better hear why. Laura, welcome.
Yeah, hi, good evening, George.
Hi.
I disagree with him because he was associating Russia to the published publications by WikiLeaks. He seemed to think that Russia was very much involved with that. But John Pilger interviewed Julian Assange recently and was very clear on that his source, that WikiLeaks source, was not Russia.
He was indeed clear, and I believe Julian Assange.
Yeah, I'd go with Julian Assange more than I would with others, actually. It was just a smear campaign by Clinton and her cronies.
Yeah, they were cranking up war with Russia. That's what they want.
Yeah, and
she
they
was
also
a mushroom cloud waiting to happen.
And instead of they didn't want people to talk about the content of the communications. They wanted the subject, the spotlight, to be shifted to some smear to their smear campaign, alleging it was coming from Russia. Whereas
I agree with you entirely. However, this is news now. Just in the last minutes, Jill Stein has raised the money, millions of dollars, in order to have these recounts of electronically counted ballots in these 3 swing states.
Yeah.
If that were to be discovered to have been fraudulent or just wrong, then that places the entire result of the presidential election in advance of the Electoral College meeting in a very great deal of doubt. Now, that would spell big, big trouble, wouldn't it?
Well, George, President Carter, who I think he's got some Election Integrity Institute, doesn't he? Even he said that America doesn't meet the minimum criteria for democracy with regard to vote. These when they send their people around the world to third world countries to make sure that the voting is authentic and genuine and everything's the protocol is good.
We could do with them here. We could do with Jimmy Carter looking at our elections.
Well, yeah, but you have to meet a minimum threshold for them to do that. And Carter said that America doesn't meet that minimum threshold because it's a joke, But when it comes to the electronic voting, George, it was found that between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton, it was common knowledge, in some some quarters, certainly when the stuff that I was researching, that wherever there was the electronic machines, Clinton would win, even if Bernie Sanders was several points ahead of her. And so they said she wasn't the authentic winner of the nominee of the DNC. He actually was. But I would be grateful, George, if you could interview Professor or Dr. Robert Fitrakis. He's a law attorney. He's a professor. He's an author of election fraud books. He's one of the people that used to go around to the third world countries to observe their elections, and he's talked about the rigging between Sanders and Clinton, and now the rigging has happened between, presumably between Trump and Clinton. So,
well, I'll tell you what, Laura, if we could rerun the election with Bernie Sanders as the Democratic candidate, that would be fantastic. But that's not what will happen. If Trump has the presidency taken away from him, it'll be given to Hillary Clinton, which will be an unmitigated disaster. By the way, Jill Stein has raised $5.19 million in 4 days. Laura, thanks for the call. Rachel says, haven't a clue what a nationalist party are doing fighting to stay in a corrupt, anti-national political union like the EU. Go on, Colin.
Hello, George. How are you?
I'm good, mate. Thanks a lot.
Well, you're sounding more fired up now. Now he's coming back.
That's guaranteed to get my blood coursing, I'll tell you.
You're winding up now. You get your armour back on. Here we go.
Absolutely.
Down 7. Oh, dear. I mean, this bloke, his buddies are all falling down in America, so he's coming back here to stick his face on our tellies again.
You can't keep a bad man down, Colin.
Oh, I think we can.
Tell me.
I think we can. I think all it needs is let him come back, let him get on the telly, and then start debating him again. All it needs is for Nigel Farage one side, 1 ear hole, you in the other, Corbyn coming from another direction, and just verbally tear his trousers off on telly.
Well, I'll tell you what, Colin, nobody in the Labour Party has said a single word about Blair coming back, and I don't understand that.
I think I do. I think they want him back at the top, and I think he's got the likes of Jackie Smith and Mrs. Balls, and they're all there wanting him.
No, they're all waiting for him. But why hasn't Corbyn or MacDonald said, we don't want you back in British politics? You are a blood-stained killer that lost us 5 million votes.
Yeah, and the problem is they want him there because they probably see that he's a good way of getting them back in. Whereas Corbyn's there at the moment, he's got his team at the front, hasn't he?
Yeah.
And you've got all those others going on Strictly Come Dancing and all that, jiggy-jagging about.
Well, if Corbyn wants to sit like Buddha in a Zen trance about it all, he's making a very, very big mistake, in my view.
This could be his big thing. Now, this could be his big moment, is to get older. I mean, what did Blair say about him?
Exactly. He said he was a nutter.
No. So what they should do is say, right, you call me a nutter. This is what gets me about Trump. Oh, we'll talk Trump as well with all this. He's got that Mormon coming in that they was wanting to take each other back of the bike sheds and all this stuff, and they're all coming back in.
Yep.
And why is he not saying, excuse me, what was it you said about me earlier? Well, let's go round the back now. We'll bring the cameras, and we'll tear your trousers off.
Okay, Colin, that's enough trousers off. Thanks a lot, my friend. Andrew is in the north of Ireland. Let's hear from him. Go ahead, Andrew.
Hi, George. Great to be back on again.
And you, sir.
Show in Belfast on Monday, so will they? Up the Falls Road, isn't it?
I hope to see you. I'm in Derry on Sunday and Belfast on Monday, South Armagh on Tuesday and Dublin on Wednesday. How's that?
That's very good. I love the fact it's on the Falls Road. They'll love me up there being a big Presbyterian and from East Belfast.
You're very, very welcome. I don't make these kind of distinctions.
I'm a Wolfstone type.
Wolfstone was a Presbyterian too.
I'm a Wolfstone one for you.
Excellent. Okay.
No, the issue of the European Union and Tony Blair.
Yeah.
Now, I'm myself someone who voted for Brexit, despite obviously wanting Irish unity, but that's mainly for historical reasons. Do you honestly think people are going to listen to Tony Blair? And, the way that The Guardian and The Independent, who, in the past, I thought they were actually reasonable newspapers, they've completely lost the plot since Brexit. So they've been writing all sorts of ridiculous headlines. So
they've completely lost the plot. And if you're talking about the public, then of course the public will not listen to Tony Blair, but the powerful listen to him and give him platforms. And that dinner last night or the night before was a very sinister gathering of extremely rich and powerful people in the British state, the deep state, and in the media echo chamber, and in the big money, big pockets men. They were all there, And this Blair show that he's going to launch in the new year is going to be something very big and powerful. And we're going to have to fight it tooth and nail, Andrew.
Indeed we are. The thing I can't understand about these so-called liberals, okay, are that if they're in favour of equality, which they are, then surely they wouldn't favour an immigration system which gives one set of rules to one people and the different to another. I mean, what's so special about a Polish person over a Belarusian, or a Swede over an Albanian, or a Spaniard over a Turk?
They don't care about equality at all, Andrew. That's just the lipstick on the pig. Thanks, Andrew. Helen's Bay in the north of Ireland. Hope to see you over the next few days. We would have better survival rates with Black Death rather than Tony Blair, says Morgan on the Move. Let's talk to Stephen in Switzerland about the US. That shows the reach of this show, doesn't it? Go ahead, Stephen.
Well, George, you and Donald Trump are the two people I've given money, two politicians I've given money to your movie about Blair.
Oh, thanks.
What I wanted to say is that all this talk about John Bolton, who's a warmonger of the worst sort, becoming Secretary of State, I can't believe that will happen. Least of all because Donald Trump's last few days took time to meet with one of Bernie Sanders' biggest supporters, Tulsi Gabbard, who's very, very strongly against war, and they talked about foreign policy. What I think has happened is that the passions in the United States are so high after this bitter election that even if Trump would appoint a Buddhist monk as Secretary of State, they would say that's the new Hitler. So what he's doing is he's running Bolton, who's a really bad guy, and he's going to let everyone tear their hair out and gnash their teeth and howl. And then once that's through, he'll appoint whoever he wants. And then they won't be able to say he's the worst because they've been hyperventilating about Bolton for so long. And I think it's pretty clever.
What do you think, Stephen, about this Jill Stein move to recount the votes? She's now raised $5.2 million, which is enough for a recount in 2 of the states, and she's now raising for Michigan. She needs another 1-point-something million.
Sometimes funny stuff happens in U.S. elections. But what's happened in these states is that in the rural areas where there's small communities, you tend to vote by hand, or vote by paper. And in the big cities where, there's many more people, it makes more sense to buy voting machines. So there is a discrepancy, but like in Wisconsin where there's a 7% discrepancy between the paper and machine, if you look between rural and city, there's a 40% discrepancy. So in other words, yes, there is a discrepancy, but it's not. And the other thing is Wisconsin is one of the states with the strictest laws about election and the cleanest elections. There are states where I'll be much more worried, but I cannot imagine that this was cooked because if you cook an election, if you stuff ballots, what you tend to see that the demographics, there's differences between demographic groups. And statisticians who've looked at it say that it's just not there, even left-leaning ones.
Well, I'll tell you what, Stephen, we're all going to be looking closely at what happens next, because there'll be serious trouble in the US if Trump is now robbed of the presidency. Thanks for calling from Switzerland. Let's go to Glasgow, where John is on the line on the same subjects. Go ahead, John.
Good evening, George.
Evening.
First of all, thank you for the dignified way you conducted your event in the East End of Glasgow.
Thank you.
Last Monday.
Thank you.
Which leads me on to the main subject, which is that all of these things, the trouble you encountered in Aberdeen, it's all this sticky label identity politics.
Yes.
It pervades the situation in Brexit, Tony Blair, Donald Trump. People don't like the referendum result. We go to court. We don't like the result. Let's have it again. Have the referendum again. I mean, what does Jill Stein get out of these recounts? I mean, she hasn't got any chance of being the president.
Well, they never put her on television during the election, but she sure will be on television now.
Yeah, I mean, she's probably a very good candidate, but the two candidates are Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. Why is she? It's a Trojan horse. It's like the lady. It's like the fund manager who's challenging Brexit. You don't like it's like ban Trump. The SNP wanted to ban Trump. Probably they want to ban you in Scotland next.
Yes. Well, they certainly haven't spoken out against what happened to me in Aberdeen.
No, they didn't speak out when Nigel Farage got a rough time in Edinburgh either.
Exactly.
So it's all sticky label, and it pervades everything. The SNP, Labour's the same. You're homophobic, you're a bigot, you're a racist, all this stuff.
They just stick labels, shout names at people instead of political argument.
And I just think they just still don't get it, this particular political class. And I just think that even though Tony Blair's coming back, they're going to be washed away by events. There's a tsunami of events around the corner. Trump has arrived. Elections and referendums in Europe. Austria might well have a right-wing president in December. I'm not saying these are good things, but events... the French elections, the Italian referendum, the Dutch have got a general election in March. They are, as far as I can see, may well be history through simply the events of our coming era.
John, you are a great caller. Thanks for that. I appreciate it very much. Marty's in Belfast. Let's hear from him. Go ahead, Marty.
Good evening, George. Thanks for taking the call.
Welcome.
George, I just want to say a number of things. I want to take issue with what Matthew Doyle was saying earlier. I think you hit the nail on the head earlier when you asked him the question, not would, but should.
Yes.
And he didn't answer it.
No, he didn't
answer it. And
there's no answer to it, Marty. He said it. He can't take it back. He's never taken it back. And so you can't say that he's campaigning for a Labour victory. He's saying that Labour should not be elected if Jeremy Corbyn is the leader.
Of course he is. And I think Corbyn is playing a good game. You may disagree at the minute, calling him a Buddha-like figure. I understand where you're coming from. I think you should be back in the party. And also, I just want to say this. The Blairite, PPE, SPAD, Oxbridge, whatever you call them, faction, have not woke up to the fact that the neoliberal model is dead. He did not mention, he talked about a coalition of the centre-left and business. He didn't mention the trade union movement, not once, didn't even hear it mentioned. No. And the Labour Party is not the PLP, it is a Labour movement. We do not want a society where 0-hour contracts are the norm. We don't want a health service sold off to the highest bidder. We don't care too much whether trading consists of 4, 3 or 2 bleeding submarines. We don't want G4S or ATOS doing the jobs of public servants or doctors while creaming us dry. We want the railways back in public ownerships. We don't want to see food banks, those charitable big society thing, just conferred upon the little people to make us feel better. We want our neighbours who have fallen on deaf or hard times to be supported until they can find their feet again. We don't want Tory party donors and payday landers charging us obscene, unscrupulous interest rates because, the only way people can access loans these days. The Blairites need to get real, and they need to wake up to the fact that it's over. The neoliberal model is dead.
Marty, brilliant call. Thank you very much indeed for that. Ford says, I'm Labour supporter, but I don't think we will win the next election, unfortunately. Keno, too, says majority of PLP, 90 to 97%, would rather help the Tories than allow an even vaguely left Labour Party get in. Problem with that, Keno, is it's their own seats that they are throwing away. And Euroman and activist says, I don't agree with Farage, but he would be a better choice for ambassador than one chosen by the Tories. And Feather says, corruption should be grounds enough for Blair's expulsion. Blair channeled millions through a web of companies. And Al in South Queensferry says we should be pressing the SNP to keep their promise to hold another indie ref in these circumstances. They're on the ropes, as you know. That's when to go for the KO. And David Benjamin says the trumpeters are backed by Russia and Iran, both rogue states. I'll tell you who the rogue state is, my dear. The United States of America. Let's go to Damien, the legend, in Brighton. Go ahead, Damien.
Good evening, George.
Hi.
George, I'd like to talk about the position of the EU regarding its negotiations over the UK withdrawing from the European Union.
Yeah.
So I think, it's all got a bit heated, and there's a bit of antagonism from the Conservatives to the EU and from the EU to this country. And I just think that the EU would be well advised to tread very carefully indeed in its dealings with the UK. And the reason I say that, George, is because it's something that you mentioned earlier this evening. It should be remembered that despite the fact that we obviously currently have a a neoliberal system which has got inequality built into it, and that's the model we're currently existing under. The fact remains that the UK is the 5th largest economy in the world. The fact also remains that the 5th largest economy in the world lies a mere 20 miles off of the continent of Europe. So I'd suggest that when you take those factors into account, and you also take into the context of the weak state of the EU and many of its member states who are in dire financial straits, the idea that the EU would declare a trade war against the UK is simply not a credible proposition.
I agree with that. But if you promise a second referendum, then you are inviting the person you're negotiating with to take the hardest possible line, aren't you?
Well, that's as may be, George, but the essence to all negotiations is there's going to have to be some compromise. So I think we're going to need to find some common ground, and I think the common ground that we've obviously got is that it would be a preference for free trade to occur between the UK and Europe. So that would happen, and it would be a good thing for us to have close relations with the EU outside of the frame.
Yeah, I want close relations with everybody in the world. Damien, the legend in Brighton, East Sussex, bringing the callers to a close. My opening monologue and our interview with Baron Tim Bell is online now at talkradio.co.uk in case you missed it. It's been marvellous for me. I hope it was for you. The show simply flew by, and if you enjoyed it, tell someone else about it and bring them with you to the listenership next week, because I need the ratings. Margaret Thatcher left us this way.